Dr. Valeria Nanclares is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in neurodevelopmental disorders with a strong emphasis on diagnosis and intervention of autism spectrum disorders. For 20 years, she has developed and directed the autism treatment program at Advocate Children's Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. She translated into Spanish the gold standard instruments for the diagnosis of autism, both the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised and the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. She provides trainings throughout the United States and Latin America, helping professionals and organizations create greater access to services and improve care for children with autism and their families. She is the Director of Program Development and Global Expansion for Echo Autism, helping to replicate Echo Autism programs in Latin America, and she serves on 2 Echo Autism hub teams, including Echo Autism Primary Care and Echo Autism Psychology. For the next 45 minutes, Dr. Nanclares will talk about everyday strategies to address behavior problems. And I can tell you that as we get ready to start this time together, I want to set the frame that we may talk about behavior problems, but I always like to remind us that all of us have differences in our behaviors, and what may seem like a problem to one may actually be a benefit to someone else. I always like to tease that my husband sometimes thinks I have behavior problems, and I probably do. But there are differences in different ways that we can certainly think about behaviors. And so when we listen together, we learn together. And I can tell you, I've learned so much about behavior from Dr. Nanclares, and I'm so delighted to have a chance for you all to hear from her as well. And I'm going to turn it over to her now so that you all can learn from her as well. So Dr. Nanclares, over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. It's great to be here and an honor to be able to present at this conference. So hopefully it'll be a day packed full of learning, and there's so many great speakers, so I'm in fantastic company. I am going to share my screen here so you can see the presentation. And just give me 1 second to set up all my little things here. All right, so hopefully everyone can see the presentation. If not, somebody will give me a holler. And as Kristen was mentioning, the focus of today is everyday strategies to address behavior problems. And that is a very relative term. What's a problem? It might be a problem for one, but not for others. But more importantly, it's just how do we approach it in a way that makes sense for each family and for each individual. So that's where the everyday strategies comes in, really thinking about it in a more individualized way. I'm hoping that today, I share these tidbits with you. One, to identify the problems interfering with effective parenting of children with developmental differences. It's not the same, and we'll go through how it may be more challenging or more difficult or different for parents who are faced with some of these developmental differences and what it means for their family. Participants will be able to understand functional analysis of behavior and the role it plays in developing an appropriate behavior intervention plan. And those are a bunch of big words, but we'll be talking a little bit more about that and how do we think and approach behavior. Identify the ABCs of behavior intervention plans, and then be able to identify everyday strategies to manage antecedents and increase structure in day-to-day activities. So we're going to focus on one aspect of the ABCs for this particular talk, which will be those antecedents. So effective parenting is difficult for anyone. I'm the first one to say it. I'm a parent of 2 teenage boys, and it is not easy. None of these things are easy. Kids are not born with a, to-do or manual in their hand. I wish they were. It would be easier for all of us. But that's really not the case. And it's really much more challenging when dealing with children with developmental differences. We need to think about things in a different way when those developmental differences are there. And a number of issues can interfere with that. On the one hand, a family may be faced with a child who has receptive language delays. They really don't understand what is said to them, and it's not an issue of them not wanting to do things or not wanting to comply. Sometimes it's just lack of understanding. Poor expressive language skills or deficits in communication, a child not being able to express what they're thinking or feeling with words. And so sometimes that expression of thought and emotion comes out in a different way, usually in the form of behaviors. Cognitive differences, they may be understanding things like a younger child. So our expectations as parents may not be aligned with where they're at, and we're not doing that on purpose, and they're not doing that on purpose. It's just a misaligned match in terms of where they're at cognitively or their understanding of things. Sensory challenges sometimes get in the way, difficulties registering and processing sensory input. What does this mean? All of the sensory stimuli from the environment, whether it's sights, sounds, tastes, textures, all of these things can be altered in terms of the processing for a child or an individual on the spectrum. And that means that their responses to the environment and to those around them will also be different. And then the presence of unusual behaviors. We know that part of the characteristics of an individual that has been given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviors. These odd or rigid behaviors that sometimes can also interfere with a parent's ability to be able to get them to transition, for example, because they have a really hard time transitioning away from things that they're really interested in or that they're very, highly motivated to engage with. And so that can also be an issue when we're talking about effective parenting. So lots of different issues can interfere with something that people usually take for granted, but it's actually quite difficult to be a parent. So when we think about behaviors don't appear overnight, right? These are behavior patterns. These are patterns that develop over time. Children with developmental differences learn to communicate in many different ways. But the flip side of that is that parents also learn to interact and respond in specific ways. And these are the patterns that develop. They begin to kind of become in sync without even realizing it. And sometimes those patterns are good. Sometimes those patterns are helpful. Sometimes those patterns work. And sometimes that's just not quite the case, right? So, sometimes, like in this little cartoon, this little guy is saying, "This is great." He's having a ball, and he's sitting and now lying in between his parents. I'll have to wake up crying in the middle of the night more often just so that I can get this, right? So neither parent wanted this. The kid did get what he wanted, but again, these are patterns. The child has figured out that if I cry enough at night, my parents will get tired, they'll pick me up, take me to bed, and all is well. So the good news and the bad news regarding behavior. Human behavior, both adaptive and maladaptive, is learned, right? And just like we learn a behavior, we can actually unlearn it. We can modify it, right? So a learned behavior is something that you're taught or you have learned to do. Just like the little boy in the cartoon learned that if he cries at night, he will be picked up, taken out of his crib, and taken to the parents' bed. That same learned behavior is something that we can unlearn or modify. And that's where all of these great strategies come into play. It's figuring out how those patterns developed and doing something to modify or switch out those patterns. So just like this little guy, so let me get this straight. I don't have to cry and yell to get my cookie. So maybe there's more socially appropriate or positive ways of doing that and achieving the same goal, which is that yummy cookie. So if we understand the behavior, we can actually modify it. So it really starts with that understanding of why the behavior is there. Challenging behaviors are any behaviors that impact learning or interaction, right? So the process of learning and the process of interacting with others, if that's disrupted by a behavior, we want to try to figure out how we can modify that so it doesn't become a disruption. Behaviors help us understand when things are going well, but they're also helping us understand when things aren't going well, when there is a problem. So both sides of the coin. All behavior is there for a reason. It serves a function, right? And this is really important to keep in mind, that behaviors aren't there just because. There is always a reason for that behavior. Whether we've figured it out or not, that's a different story. But the behavior is always there for a reason. And it's kind of our job a little bit as detectives, along with the families, to figure out what that behavior is there for, and how to help modify it or tweak it. Behavior is communication. It is communicating something to us. And so we need to learn to listen to that communication so that we can figure out how to best address those problematic behaviors, those behaviors that are actually getting in the way of interaction and learning, right? So when I think of problematic behavior, it is exactly that. It's those behaviors that aren't allowing the individual to do the things that they really want to do, or for the family to function in the way that best suits them, and that allows for a happy, functional environment for everyone. So that's what we're going to be when we're thinking challenging or problematic behaviors. That's what we're really trying to address. So when we think of behaviors, really what we're seeing is the tip of the iceberg, right? The behavior that we see is there's so much more underneath that is really what we need to address, right? So I often talk to parents when we talk about this, kind of like the behavior is a fever. The fever can be there for a variety of different reasons. If we address the fever and we just give some sort of medication or something to bring down the fever, we really haven't addressed the source of the fever. So as soon as the medication wears off, the fever is going to spike up again, right? And so even though we were effective maybe for a little while, we're not as effective as really looking at the meaning behind the challenging behavior, everything that's underneath the water that we can't see readily. And that's where the magic happens. If we can address that source, then the behavior will be modified. So to understand how to change a behavior, we need to understand the meaning or the trigger. There's a variety of different words for this. And in behavior analysis, we talk about the function of the behavior. And there's a variety of different functions, but they kind of fall within these four categories. Sensory is one, and we talked a little bit about this, right? Sensory responses, either having hypo responses, meaning not enough responses to environmental stimuli, or hyper responses, being very overly responsive, overly sensitive to sounds, overly sensitive to touch. So these sensory responses can be part of these triggers or the meaning of the challenging behavior. Sometimes it's there for escape or avoidance, meaning I don't want to do something, and so I'm going to engage in this behavior because I want to get out of a particular situation. Sometimes it's to access attention, get mom and dad's attention or the teacher's attention, or a sibling's attention. Maybe I'm not doing it in the best way, but in the end, what's happening, they're paying a lot of attention because of the behavior that I'm engaging in. So even if it's negative attention, it's still attention. And so oftentimes a behavior can be there for access to attention, and then access to a tangible or something, right? We saw the little boy got to sleep in his parents' bed. So that's kind of a mixture of attention and the reward of sleeping in the bed. So it's access to things that can also be a function of the behavior. So how do we understand the function? And we do this through something called a functional analysis of behavior. A functional analysis really examines the causes and the consequences of behavior. And that's really what we're looking at. And this is that ABC model that we were talking about. The ABC model stands A for the antecedent, B for the behaviors, and C for the consequence, what comes right after the behavior. So this antecedent behavior consequence model is a tool that can help people examine behaviors they want to change. We need to figure out those patterns that have developed over time that include the triggers behind the behaviors and the impact those behaviors are having, and what keeps them going, what maintains them, which is that consequence. So usually behaviors come in this tight little package that has to do with this kind of ABC model. And so a functional analysis of behavior really looks at these three areas of the antecedents, everything that could have possibly triggered that behavior. What does the behavior look like? And then what keeps it going? What has maintained it? And sometimes the consequence is tricky because we don't even realize, oftentimes as parents, and I see this myself with my own kids, I didn't even realize that what I did or I said actually made the situation better or worse. And so it's going to make it more or less likely to happen in the future. And we'll talk more about this. So the ABCs of behavior is kind of the way that it flows, and the functional analysis of behavior really helps us tease each one of these apart for each behavior and figure out what these patterns are, so we know what we're addressing, right? So the A is those cues, the antecedent, what comes before the behavior. The behavior is the response itself that the child engages in, and then, or the individual. And then consequences, what comes right after, what maintains it, right? So this is the ABC is really important when understanding or trying to develop a functional analysis of behavior. So in this example of an antecedent, asking the child to sit down is the antecedent. The parent says, sit down, the child sits down. The consequence is that the child gets to play with cars because they actually followed the instruction, right? This is a very, very simple and simplified way of looking at an antecedent, but it's good to just think about that sometimes it's super simple like this, and other times it can be a little bit more complex, and trying to tease it apart is a little bit more difficult. So anything can be an antecedent. It could be a direction that is given or an instruction that is given. It could be a specific event. It could be a phrase. It could be something that they've heard. It could be something that they've seen, someone's action, a noise, a smell. There's so many things that can be an antecedent, and that's what makes it a little bit challenging. We need to figure out what are those triggers, what has made this behavior happen. Sometimes those are obvious, like sit down and the child sits down. Other times we don't know what that antecedent is, and that is part of our detective work when we are looking at the ABCs and trying to complete a functional analysis of behavior. The C in the ABC is the consequence, right? So we, if we look at what can maintain, what comes after that behavior, the consequence will usually make the behavior more or less likely to reoccur, right? So in the case of this cartoon, the teacher is saying, you cannot hit people at school, you should know better, go see the principal now. So that seems like a really negative consequence. You know, you're being sent to the principal's office, but maybe that's exactly what the child wanted. The child wanted to get out of that situation, did not want to be in math class. And this is perfect. I get out of math and I get to go sit with the principal. So what seems to some as a negative consequence might be for others a reinforcer for that behavior. So that child learned that if they don't want to stay in math, all they have to do is hit another child and they'll be sent to the principal's office. And yay, I got out of math class, right? And so this is kind of that behavioral model. Sometimes we need to do a little bit of detective work to figure out, you know, what it is that comes before, what those behaviors are, and the consequence. And this is just a loop that feeds and retrofeeds. So consequences can be all sorts of things. It can come in the form of what I just showed you. It could also be stickers. You know, we often think of like these positive things like rewards, a prize box. You know, all these things are super common in schools. If you get 5 stars or 5 stickers, then you get to choose from my prize box, a goodie, or you get a certificate or an award, or a note goes home of good job. You know, all of these are positive, but there can also be the flip side, the ones that are, you know, it's a warning, you weren't behaving today, or there's a phone call home because you didn't do something, or you hit a child, right? So these are all part of the consequences. And it's just important, there's a variety of different consequences that we can look at, both reinforcement and punishment. And it's important to note that, you know, reinforcement tends to increase a behavior, punishment is there to decrease the behavior. But sometimes it doesn't quite work the same when we're trying to develop these intervention plans. We really need to see what actually is rewarding or not for that particular child. And that's the trick sometimes. So prevention is the best medicine. We've heard this many, many times. So we're going to start focusing on antecedents. It's where, you know, I think the best work happens. You know, certainly we need to work on when the behavior has happened, what to do afterwards. But the best way to address a behavior, if we want to modify it, is to set it up so that the behavior that we want is there, and the behavior that we don't want doesn't actually get triggered or doesn't actually happen. So we want to try to work on those triggers. What cues or sets off a behavior that we don't want? Identify antecedents that increase positive behavior. What sort of triggers or things can we set up from the get-go so the behavior that we do want to see is actually there? So once we know the triggers, we can work on antecedent controls. And that is something that makes the behavior more or less likely to occur from the get-go. So we're not just dealing on the consequence side. We're not dealing when it's already kind of too late and the behavior's there. It would be great if we could set up the environment in such a way that we set it up for success, right? We set it up so that the individual responds in the way we want them to respond, and then we can reinforce, we can reward. The consequence can be positive for the child and for the family. So that's really what we're focused on. So there's some kind of common antecedent controls. One has to do with structuring the environment. Children, in particular individuals with autism, really like structure. They like things in a way that they can understand them and that they're easily understood. And oftentimes providing that structure is somewhat sufficient, right, as an antecedent control. It provides information about expectations. It reduces miscommunication, reduces problems due to cognitive differences, those things that we were talking about before in the very first slide. What are things that get in the way for effective parenting? And so if we know that there's going to be some of those differences, we know homework is a nightmare, right? And the child doesn't know how to organize themselves, and they don't know what to do with their things when they're done. You know, a simple folder system at home where when the child gets home, organizing on one side you have to do, on the other side you have finished. You're going to do homework number 1, homework number 2, and homework number 3 in that order. And setting up that structure sometimes just makes it really clear what the expectation is for the child. You need to finish these 3 tasks. You're going to start from the left, take it from your to-do side, and when you're done, you're going to put it in your finish side. So something as simple as that, just to help with homework, which tends to be a nightmare for many of us, not just parents who have children with developmental differences. Sometimes just modifying how something is presented. We know that in terms of the neuropsychological profile, individuals with autism tend to be much more in tune to visual rather than auditory. They're much more visual learners. That's not to say that they all are. So this is where the individualized is so important, but many are. And so organizing things in such a way, this picture here is really about organizing the environment. But this is something that can be done at home, right? Finding, eliminating distractions, using visual cues to allow the person to understand, I have this shelf with things on the left that I need to work on. The red dot is where I'm going to stand, and putting things on the right when I'm done. This also helps with this left to right sort of format, or top to bottom, helps with scanning and reading and all these other skills that we're developing. So presenting it visually, presenting it in a way that they understand, where it's clear what I need to do, what the expectation is, and when am I finished, right? I know that I'll be done when I'm done with my third folder, or when all of these baskets that I need to complete are on the right side. There's other types of antecedent controls that are very easily used at home. Providing schedules for the activities of the day. These are really, really successful in classrooms. And I've been working with parents for years, incorporating schedules in the home. It makes the expectations of what's going to happen throughout the day easier, and it helps organize the child. And that organization and structure oftentimes has a positive impact in and of itself, because it relieves a little bit of the anxiety of not knowing what's coming next. So depending on the child's developmental level, that might need to be an object schedule. So instead of these pictures, it might actually have to be, some Cheerios stuck on a little cardboard so that they know that it's breakfast time, for example. A little school bus, that means the school is coming to pick you up to go to, a school bus is picking you up to go to school. Visual schedules like the one that we have here, Jack's Thursday schedule, that just kind of lets him know what the activities are going to be throughout the day, or sometimes just written, for the older kids, just maybe in the morning sitting down and what the activities of the day are going to be, and it could be a whiteboard that then gets erased at the end of the day. So just having a way of providing kind of structure to the day can be very helpful. First, then boards are really, really helpful. And especially for those kids who don't understand, they're focused on what they want, and they don't understand that they need to do a particular activity first. And these, are based on the Premack principle, of kind of doing something less desirable first, followed by something more desirable, will make the less desirable more likely to happen. And so gaining access to a preferred object or activity by doing something that maybe they don't love to do, but then, it's kind of an extra motivator. So first thens are really, really helpful. And again, keeping them visual will make it very clear, and it reduces the amount of language that a parent needs to use, the amount of language that the child needs to understand. Presenting it in a visual format will make it very clear what the expectation is, and then the expectation for the gaining the desired activity or object. Anticipate transitions. This is a big one in kind of day-to-day functioning. That you need to transition the child away from something that they really enjoy, whether it's video games or TV or a favorite toy or activity, and we need to transition them away to come for dinner or to do their homework or do something else. So giving warnings is helpful. Using timers, there's all sorts of timers. The visual timer is really, really helpful because it allows the child to see as the time is fading away in a way. And so timers can be really helpful. Visual countdowns can be really helpful, right? Like the one in this picture here. So there's a variety of different ways where we can anticipate the routine so that it doesn't just abruptly come on to the child, and the child prepares, or the individual can prepare for the transition. Antecedent controls. Part of these antecedent controls are making sure to pay attention to setting events. Sometimes it's things like the child didn't sleep, right? And so we all get super, um, fussy and irritable when we don't get good sleep. We're not in our best mood. Our intention is not great. We're a little bit more snappy. Why wouldn't kids have the same issue, right? And so making sure that the child is getting a good night rest. And if there are sleep issues, really addressing those sleep issues with the pediatrician or other providers to make sure that the child is getting good rest. Hunger, sometimes, hunger can play a role and be the reason why this child is more irritable. Any sort of illness or sensory overload. These situations where we don't realize that it can be overstimulating because it's not for us, but it may be for another child, for a child on the spectrum. The general crowd noise that we hear in malls or in restaurants, that general hum, those noises can be extremely irritating and oftentimes are the reasons why these meltdowns happen or difficulties happen or problematic behaviors happen in grocery stores or in restaurants or family gatherings, things like that, that tend to be really difficult. So one of the things that I always talk about with families is just don't overstay your welcome, right? Don't plan your largest grocery shopping trip of the week with your child, um, unless your child is fully capable of doing that. So plan on doing that without your child. Plan to stay less time in an overstimulating environment. Plan to have things for your child to be engaged with during those activities. So that plan ahead, right? So don't just show up and expect everything to work well. The more we can work with these things beforehand, the more successful it is, and the more successful your trip will be, and the happier everyone will be, right? It'll be a success for the child. We want the child to be building those successes, and it'll be a success for the family as well. So for example, in this picture, the little boy is wearing some noise canceling headphones. So there seems to be a large crowd. It could be a variety of things. It could be the Air and Water Show. It could be 4th of July. It could be so many things, right? But all of these events can be extremely overstimulating and cause a lot of distress. And so preparing ahead of time and knowing maybe I can only stay for a little while and keep the situation positive, right? The more we can prepare and plan ahead of time and have each experience be a positive one, the more we'll be able to extend that the next time we go. So if the first time we plan to be there 5 minutes and it was successful, now we have a positive experience to build on. The next time, maybe we can stay 7 minutes or 10 minutes. And each time that'll be the fact that the situation went well and the child was comfortable will be, again, one of those positive consequences. It'll start building up and make it more likely that the child will accept going the next time. So antecedent controls are extremely important because they lay the foundation for what's going to happen. And obviously what we want to happen is for the response to be a positive one for the child, which will only then impact positively the entire family, right? So we want these positive experiences on both ends, both for the child and for the family. And these are just simple strategies that can be incorporated on a daily basis, to be able to make those situations more successful. And most importantly, I think one of the things that is most altered when I speak with families is family functioning and the things that they used to do that they no longer do, oftentimes because of the presence of some of these problematic behaviors, either because the family's embarrassed or it creates situations or others don't understand. And so they don't invite him as much anymore. There's a variety of reasons why these challenging behaviors can really be impacting really negatively the family life. And so these are really important, and having some tricks up your sleeve in terms of how to think about those behaviors. What just happened? Think back. What was in the environment right before that challenging behavior emerged? Was it something I said? Was there something in the environment that contributed? Was the child responding to something sensory? Did they get exactly what they wanted? We went to the store and the child had a really negative, reaction when I took that candy bar away. And it was so bad that, I was so embarrassed, I then bought the candy bar. Well, what the child learned in that situation is if they fuss enough and the behavior is challenging enough, they might get that candy bar. Now, at the time, obviously, as a parent, you're not thinking that. You're just trying to manage the situation, which of course causes a lot of anxiety and stress. And so these are the situations where tools and resources are needed. What can we do ahead of time? So if the child has something that they're distracted with, or they know that there's one thing that they can get when you go to the grocery store, and here are the pictures of the possible things you can choose, giving the child a choice of something that they can get. These are ways that we can anticipate and plan ahead. And make sure that that whole situation is more successful. So just kind of in closing, remember behaviors are learned, right? We're not born with these behaviors. Behaviors are learned. And just like we learn them, we can unlearn them. They can be modified. And so what are the things that we can do to help families modify behaviors that are interfering with functioning, interfering with their child's functioning, interfering with their family's functioning is really, really key. Behaviors communicate, they tell us, right? So this little boy on the top right-hand side, he's communicating something. He's really upset and we're not really sure what that is. And it's figuring out, is he upset because whatever toy the parent has in their hand right now is being put away? Are they upset because the parent is not doing it quick enough? Are they upset because it broke? What is the function of that crying? And it looks like he's about to hit, right? And so there's a reason why that behavior is there. The child is communicating something. It's about figuring out through those functional analysis of behavior what it means underneath that iceberg, underneath the water, what is actually happening at this point, and being able to be much more targeted with our interventions if we know what the function is. If the function is to communicate frustration, let's figure out a way to give this child strategies to communicate that in a way that doesn't lead to this level of crying or hitting. And so those are the things that we're trying to figure out through a functional analysis of behavior and really targeted interventions. Simple everyday strategies can be super effective. And I've seen this over the many years I've been in practice, families really being successful at figuring out, because once you get into this mindset of thinking of the ABCs continuously, you don't need a degree to do that. You just need to know how to think about it. And so these everyday simple strategies, the parents would often come up with things that I had never thought of before, because they know their child best and they know the types of things that could or couldn't be part of this pattern, and what could be a great way to create a trigger or a cue beforehand that will make sure that a positive behavior is there, and what are the things that we can put in place afterwards to maintain it. So these everyday strategies can be super effective, and they're not difficult to learn once you learn how to think behaviorally, once you learn how to think about these ABCs. And I think it's a very powerful strategy. Prevention strategies are the best. They're the best ways of addressing things and trying to figure out so that the behavior is not there. So we're not dealing with challenging or problematic or negative behaviors. We're dealing with the types of behaviors that we want to increase and see more of. That's not to say that there won't be challenging behaviors. Of course there will. But trying to minimize those that are difficult and increase the amount of times the child is responding in the way that we'd like them to. Find ways to reinforce good behavior, right? This is probably the most difficult one because as parents, we really get focused on those 1 or 2 times that the child doesn't do what they were supposed to do. And we're all over that, but sometimes we forget to talk about the times where they did do something right, where they had really good manners at the table. This is something I'm dealing with right now. So I tend to focus on the times where those manners aren't quite effective or aren't quite as good as I'd like. And I forget to mention all the many times where those manners are good. So focus on good behavior and really trying to reinforce that. It's really easy to focus on the negative and forget to provide feedback when the child is actually doing what they're supposed to do. So just final thought with this little cartoon at the bottom. I'm behaving well. Are you sure you wouldn't like to positively reinforce it? So just as a reminder that we need to reinforce positive behavior as well. So thank you very much. I hope it was a fun learning experience.